The binding cord was already looped twice around Yash Steeljaw's wrist when the scout came crashing through the crowd, blood sheeting down his arm, screaming a word that turned the whole wedding to ice. Ambush. The Bell farm burned. They're all dead, all of them. The Ashclaw did it. The crossroads square of Thornwell Crossing had never held so many people at once, nor so many kinds of them. Human drovers stood shoulder to shoulder with orc traders along the fence rails. Children perched on hay bales to see over the crowd. Banners of dyed hide and rough-spun cloth snapped in the wind above the stone altar where Elder Ushka, the Steeljaw clan's aged shaman, had been chanting the joining words only a heartbeat before. And at the center of it all stood Yash Steeljaw, magnificent in a fitted wedding leather the color of dried blood and autumn ochre, beadwork of bone and copper stitched along her collar, her dark hair braided back from a face that could stop men's hearts with a glance now gone rigid with dawning fury. Beside her stood Gorek Ashclaw, son of Chief Malek Ashclaw, broad as a barn door and twice as smug, his ceremonial furs still draped over one shoulder. He did not deny it. That was the thing Jedediah Quinn would remember most, afterward, lying awake and turning the moment over like a stone in his palm. Gorek did not even flinch. The Bell farm sat on land my father's line held before your grandfather's treaty stole it, Gorek said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, loud enough that there was no mistaking he meant to be heard. A few dead farmers is a small price for what is owed. Once your clan's strength stands behind mine, Yash, no human border will hold against us. This truce was always rope for hanging weaker men. I only cut it early. The wounded scout Tomas Bell himself, blood-soaked and swaying, the last of his family, as it turned out collapsed at the altar's edge. It was Jedediah who caught him. Jedediah Quinn had been standing near the back of the crowd with his medic satchel slung over one shoulder out of long habit, because a gathering that size always meant someone fainted from the heat or cut themselves on tent stakes, and someone always needed him. He had not expected to catch a dying man's confession of massacre in his arms. He pressed both palms hard against the gash in Tomas's side, shouting for cloth, for whiskey, for anyone to help him. And even as he worked, he heard the square around him go silent in that terrible way silence falls before a storm breaks. Yash Steeljaw turned to face the man she was meant to marry, and something in her face closed like a door. "You raided under a truce banner," she said, and her voice did not shake, though the whole square seemed to. "You murdered a farming family to prove a point to me. On my wedding day. For our future," Gorek said, reaching for her hand as though nothing at all had changed. "For the strength of our children, Yash, you knew what our peoples needed." "I know what you are now," she said, and ripped the binding cord from her wrist so hard the copper beads scattered across the stone altar like spilled coin. Elder Ushka stumbled back. Chief Draga Steeljaw, Yash's father, rose from his seat of honor with a roar building in his throat, torn between the shame of a broken alliance and pride swelling hot and sudden in his chest at his daughter's refusal to bend. Gorek's face darkened. "You would shame me in front of both our peoples. You would shame your own father, your own clan, for the sake of dead human strangers." "I would shame no one but you," Yash said. "You did that yourself, the moment you thought murder was a wedding gift." The crowd had gone utterly still, human and orc both, caught between fear of what came next and the terrible thrill of watching history crack open in front of them. Jedediah, still on his knees with Tomas Bell's blood soaking through his sleeves, looked up just as Yash Steeljaw turned away from the altar, away from Gorek Ashclaw, away from her own father's stricken face, and scanned the crowd like a woman searching for solid ground in a flood. Her eyes found him. She crossed the square in long, sure strides, the crowd parting before her the way water parts before a ship's prow, and she went down on one knee in the dirt beside him, heedless of her wedding leathers, heedless of every eye in Thornwell Crossing fixed upon her. "Is he going to live?" she asked, nodding at Tomas. "If I get him stitched in the next few minutes, yes," Jedediah said, hands not stopping their work even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Good." Yash Steeljaw looked at him, then truly looked. the way she had looked at him 100 times over the past 3 months, except now there was nothing holding her back, no duty left standing between them, nothing but the astonished silence of an entire crossroads town waiting to see what a jilted orc bride would do next. "Jedediah Quinn," she said, loud enough that every soul in that square heard it, loud enough that Gorak Ashklaw's face went the color of ash. "Marry me instead." The silence that followed was so complete that Jedediah could hear the creak of wagon wheels 3 streets over. He stared up at her, blood on his hands, a dying man's weight against his knee, and for one impossible heartbeat he thought he had misheard her over the ringing in his own ears. "Yash," he started. "I'm not asking as a jest," she said, and something vulnerable flickered beneath the fury in her golden eyes, something that looked, for just a moment, like fear that he would refuse her in front of everyone. "I am asking because I meant to spend my life choosing peace with a man who would only ever choose blood. I would rather choose a man who chooses to save lives instead. I would rather choose you." Behind her, Gorak Ashklaw let out a sound like a wounded bull and started forward, and the whole story of how they had gotten to this moment, the barrels, the wager, the falling wall of oak casks, the stolen kiss he had spent 3 months trying to forget, rose up in Jedediah's chest all at once, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his whole life patching other people's wounds and never once tending his own heart, that there was only one answer he could give her. But to understand why Yash Steeljaw knelt in the dust of Thornwell Crossing and asked a cooper to marry her instead of a chief's son, you have to go back 3 months, to the first day she ever set foot in his shop and called his craftsmanship an insult to real barrel makers. Thornwell Crossing sat at the meeting of 4 roads in a wide, dusty valley where the Eastern Kingdom's wagon trails crossed the old orc migration paths down from the Ashgree Mountains. It was not a large town, but it was a loud one, crowded 3 seasons out of 4 with traders, drovers, orc caravans bringing hides and iron ore south, human merchants hauling grain and cloth north, and enough saloons, smithies, and trading posts crammed along its rutted main street to keep every one of them busy. A treaty 2 decades old kept an uneasy peace here, orcs, and humans did not love each other, not by a long stretch, old wars leaving old scars on both sides. But Thornwell Crossing had learned that coin spent the same regardless of the hand that held it, and so the crossroads had become one of the few places where the 2 peoples did more trading than fighting. Jedediah Quinn had lived there his whole life. He was not a large man, nor a particularly striking one, brown hair going a little wild no matter how often he cut it, sun-weathered hands, a quiet, watchful way about him that made people forget he was in the room until they needed him. His father had been a cooper before him, and his father before that, and the Quinn barrels were known up and down the crossing roads for holding water, without a drop lost even after 100 miles of wagon jolting. But it was during the border skirmishes 11 years back, when Jedediah had been barely more than a boy helping haul supply wagons, that he had learned the other trade that people in Thornwell Crossing valued him for even more than his barrel-stitching wounds, setting bones, boiling willow bark for fever, packing bleeding gashes with clean moss and honey, until a real physician could be found, which in a town like this was almost never. There was no proper doctor within 3 days' ride. There was only Jedediah Quinn, his cooper's steady hands, and the battered leather satchel he never let far from his side. He had stitched drovers and drunk gamblers and orc guards alike over the years, never asking which side of the old wars a man's grandfather had fought on before he pressed a needle to torn skin. It had made him a strange kind of fixture at the crossing, too rough-handed and plain-spoken for the gentry who passed through, too human for the orc caravans to fully trust, too solitary in his own quiet way to ever quite belong anywhere. He had made his peace with that mostly. A man could build a good life out of barrels and bandages, even a lonely one. That peace ended the afternoon Yash Steeljaw strode into his cooper's yard with 6 of her father's warriors at her back and announced, in a voice that carried over the whole market square, that human barrels were an embarrassment. "They split at the seams," she said, striking one of his finished water casks with the flat of her hand hard enough to make the iron hoops ring. They leak. My father's caravan lost half a wagon's worth of water to bad staves not 2 days from here, bought from your very shop, Cooper. Jedediah set down the plane he'd been using to shape a stave and looked up at her properly for the first time. She was, without question, the most striking woman he had ever seen in his life, orc or human. Tall enough to meet his eyes without tilting her head, built with the kind of powerful, sculpted strength that came from a life spent in saddle and battle rather than idleness. Her green-gray skin smooth and sun-warmed, small ivory tusks framing a mouth currently curled in open scorn. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and supple, laced snug up her sides and across a bodice reinforced with narrow steel plates at the shoulders. A wide belt cinched at her waist bearing a bronze buckle worked in the shape of a wolf's head, her father's clan sigil. Her black hair was braided back tight from a face all sharp, proud angles, and her eyes, when they fixed on him, were a deep amber gold that seemed to measure him and find him wanting in the space of a single breath. "That water cask was bought second-hand from a trader out of Milford," Jedediah said evenly, wiping wood shavings from his hands. "Not one of mine. You can tell by the cooper's mark. Mine's a quail burned into the head stave. That one there's got no mark at all, which tells me it was cheap work sold as good work, same as anyone can get cheated by, orc or human." A few of the men behind Yash chuckled at that, and her jaw tightened. "You would defend your whole trade rather than admit weakness." "I'd defend good craft from bad, same as I'd wager you defend a good blade from a rusted one," Jedediah said. "Doesn't mean all blades are rusted." The crowd gathering at the edge of the yard, drovers, a few loitering guards, a knot of orc traders who'd followed Yash's party in from the road went quiet with interest at the exchange, the way any crossroads crowd went quiet at the smell of a good argument brewing. Yash studied him a long moment, something sharpening in her expression that was not quite anger anymore. "Prove it, then. Prove your barrel is worth the name burned into it. How would you like me to do that?" "I will break it," she said simply. "If it holds, I will admit human coopers are not all fools. If it breaks, you will admit your craft is as weak as the rest of your kind's promises." It was, Jedediah would later admit, an absurd wager to accept from a woman who could very likely tear a wagon wheel off its axle with her bare hands. But there was something in the challenge in her eyes, something that made his pride quiet, stubborn, rarely provoked rise up hot in his chest for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Done," he said. "But if it holds, you owe me an apology in front of this whole yard." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Very well, Cooper. Bring me your finest work." He fetched one of his best casks, freshly whooped, tight-jointed white oak staves fitted so close a hair couldn't slip between them, and set it upright in the yard's packed dirt. The crowd had swelled to 24 by then, drovers calling wagers to one another, a couple of orc guards laughing low and betting iron pieces against the human cooper's pride. Yash Steeljaw rolled her shoulders, planted her boots, and drove her fist down onto the top of the cask with a force that would have shattered a lesser man's ribs. The oak staves groaned. The iron hoops sang under the strain, but the cask held. She struck it again, harder, a crack splitting the air like a thunderclap, and still the joints held, the hoops flexing and snapping back true the way good cooperage should. A murmur ran through the crowd. She set her hands on either side of the cask's rim and heaved upward, trying to wrench it apart at the seams with raw strength, muscles standing out along her forearms, and Jedediah found himself, absurdly, more concerned with the fate of his cask than with the possibility she might simply decide to break him next. The cask held. Yash straightened, breathing hard, staring at the unbroken barrel with an expression somewhere between disbelief and genuine, dawning respect. "Well," she said at last, and this time there was no mistaking the smile, "it seems I owe a cooper an apology." The crowd, which a moment before had been laughing at the human's expense, now erupted into a different kind of noise entirely, jeering good-naturedly at Yash's warriors, coin-changing hands. One grizzled orc guard clapped Jedediah hard enough on the shoulder to stagger him, laughing, "Good barrel, little man. Good barrel." Yash Steeljaw looked at him across the yard, and something passed between them. Not quite friendship yet, not quite anything with a name, but the first thread of a connection neither of them had expected to find at a crossroads market on an ordinary afternoon. "I am Yash Steeljaw," she said, "daughter of Chief Draga Steeljaw." "Jedediah Quinn," he said, "Cooper, and apparently the only human at this crossing whose barrels you find tolerable." "Do not let it go to your head, Cooper," she said, but she was still smiling, and it changed her whole face, softened the sharp, proud lines of it into something Jedediah found he wanted very badly to see again. She did not leave the crossing the next day, as her father's caravan had originally planned. There were negotiations to finish, trade routes to settle, and though neither of them said it aloud for a long while, a reason for Yash Steeljaw to find excuses to walk past the Cooper's yard more often than any trade business strictly required. It became a kind of ritual over the following weeks. She would come to needle him about his prices, and he would needle her back about her clan's supposedly superior craftsmanship. And somewhere in the back and forth they would end up sharing a meal at the edge of his workshop, or she would help him haul a load of green oak in from the wagon simply because she was there, and it needed doing, and her strength made the work laughably easy for her. She brought him a length of ironwood once, rare and nearly unworkable but prized for its watertightness, hauled all the way down from the high slopes where her clan hunted, and dropped it at his feet with the gruff announcement that she was tired of watching him struggle with inferior local timber. He made her a small cask no bigger than a lantern, fitted so tight it could hold spirits for 100 years without a drop escaping, and gave it to her without a word, and the look on her face when she realized what it meant, that he had spent 3 nights of careful, patient work on something that served no purpose, except that she might like it stayed with him long after. It was during this time that Jedediah first began to understand what kind of woman Yash Steeljaw truly was, beneath the pride and the sharp tongue. He watched her stop a drunken drover from beating his mule in the street, lifting the man clean off his feet by the collar with one hand while she informed him, in a voice gone dangerously soft, that cruelty to helpless things was a coward's habit. He watched her sit for an hour with an orphan trading boy who'd lost his whole family to fever on the road, saying nothing, simply staying, because the boy did not want to be alone, and she understood, better than most, what that kind of hollow felt like. She was fierce and proud and utterly unafraid of anything Thornwell Crossing could throw at her, but she was also, he came to realize, lonelier than she let anyone see a chief's daughter groomed since birth for a political marriage she had never wanted, respected by her clan but rarely truly known by anyone in it. He, in turn, stitched up 2 of her father's guards after a skirmish with bandits on the eastern road, working through the night without complaint, refusing payment when Chief Draga Steeljaw himself offered it, saying only that a wound didn't care whose blood it was, and neither did he. Word of that spread through the Steeljaw camp faster than any official treaty ever could, and Jedediah found himself, for the first time in his life, genuinely welcome among a people who had every historical reason to distrust him. It was on a warm evening some 6 weeks into this slow, circling courtship that the crisis came that would change everything between them. Jedediah's Cooper yard backed onto a slope where he stacked finished barrels 3 and 4 high, ready for loading onto the trade wagons that rolled through each week. He had been up on a ladder that afternoon, checking hoops on the top row, when a spooked cart horse 2 yards overthrew its harness and bolted, crashing sideways into the support timbers that braced the barrel stack. The whole towering wall of oak casks groaned, shifted, and began to topple, directly toward the ladder, directly toward Jedediah, who had just enough time to realize what was happening before the world came apart in a roar of falling wood. He heard, afterward, that the crowd gathered nearby drovers, a few off-duty guards, a cluster of men who had spent the better part of the week making snide comments about orcs sniffing around human coopers, had gone utterly silent, certain they were about to watch a man die. Yash Steeljaw had been 40 yards away, haggling over grain prices at a trade stall, when she heard the crack of splitting timber and Jedediah's name shouted in alarm. What happened next would be told and retold at the crossing for years afterward, growing taller with each telling, though the truth needed no exaggeration. She did not run around the falling stack. She ran into it. She threw herself bodily beneath the collapsing wall of barrels, planting her boots, driving her shoulder and both arms upward into hundreds of pounds of falling oak and iron, and held the entire toppling stack suspended at a furious, straining angle, muscles screaming, tendons standing out along her neck like drawn rope, long enough for Jedediah to scramble down and clear from beneath the ladder. The moment he was free, she let the stack crash the rest of the way down and away from him, barrels bursting apart against the packed earth in a thunder of splintered staves, and stood there in the drifting dust, chest heaving, arms trembling from the effort, staring at him with an expression of such raw, naked terror at what had almost happened that it took his breath away worse than the fall itself had. The crowd that had been laughing and jeering about orcs and coopers not an hour before stood in absolute, stunned silence. Not one of them said a word. A woman had just held back a collapsing wall of barrels with her bare arms to save a man's life, and there was nothing left in any of them to jeer with. Jedediah crossed the wreckage of his own workshop and took her face in both his hands, an act of familiarity neither of them had allowed before. Hands that had stitched 100 wounds now trembling as they touched her jaw, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. "You could have been crushed," he said, voice cracking. "You could have been," she said back fierce, and then she kissed him. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of a woman who had just watched death come within a hand's width of the man she had not yet let herself admit she loved, hungry and desperate, and full of every unspoken thing that had passed between them over 6 weeks of barrels and stolen glances and quiet evenings that had gone on far too long to be about trade. Jedediah kissed her back with everything he had, one hand sliding into her dark braided hair, the other still shaking against her jaw, and for one long, breathless moment the whole crossing, the wreckage, the silent crowd, the entire complicated, dangerous truth of what they were fell away entirely. Then Yash pulled back, breathing hard, and something like grief crossed her face. "I cannot," she said. "Jedediah, I am promised. My father has already agreed terms with the Ashclaw clan. This marriage keeps 2 clans from war, keeps the truce here standing. I do not have the right to want this. Yash, please." Her voice broke on the word, the first time he had ever heard anything like weakness in her. "Do not make it harder than it already is." She left him standing in the ruin of his own barrel stack, and for the 3 months that followed, though neither of them ever fully managed to stay away from the other a shared meal here, a wound tended there, an ache in both their chests that refused to quiet no matter how firmly they told themselves it must. She held to her word. She did not kiss him again. She did not let herself reach for him, though he caught her looking at him more than once with a longing so plain it nearly undid every careful boundary she had built. Duty, she told him once over a shared bowl of stew at his workshop table, one of the few quiet evenings they allowed themselves, was not a thing a Steeljaw simply discarded because her heart wanted differently. "Peace matters more than what I want," she said quietly that night, staring into the bowl rather than at him. "If I refuse Gorak, the Ashclaw clan may simply take by force what they cannot get by treaty. Innocent people would die for my selfishness. I would rather ache the rest of my life than let that happen." Jedediah had reached across the table then and covered her hand with his not a kiss, not a claim, just the simple, steady warmth of his palm against her knuckles, the achingly patient kind of touch a man offers when he loves someone too much to ask for more than she can give. "Then I'll ache with you," he'd said, quietly, "however long it takes." he had meant it. He had told himself, in the weeks that followed, that he could bear watching her marry another man if it meant the crossroads stayed at peace, if it meant the fragile, unlikely thing between orc and human that this town represented did not shatter over his own selfish wanting. It was only when Gorak Ashclaw stood at that altar and confessed, without a shred of shame, to burning a family alive to prove a point, that the calculation Yash had built her whole sacrifice upon collapsed entirely. There was no peace to protect anymore. There was only a truce already broken, and a man who had shown her exactly what kind of husband and what kind of leader he intended to be. Which was how Yash Steeljaw came to be kneeling in the dirt of Thornwell Crossing Square, blood on her wedding leathers from where she'd knelt beside a dying man, asking a cooper to marry her instead, while the whole crossroads held its breath around them. "Yash," Jedediah said again, and this time his voice was steady, even as Tomas Bell groaned beneath his hands and the crowd pressed close and Gorak Ashclaw's furious shout rang across the square. "Yes, God's help me, yes, but finish this first, help me get him to my shop, or he won't live to see anyone married." Something fierce and grateful and entirely undone crossed Yash's face, and then she was moving, scooping the wounded scout up in her arms as easily as a child might carry a doll, cradling him with a gentleness that belied every ounce of the strength Jedediah had watched her use to hold back a wall of falling barrels. "Lead the way, Cooper," she said, and there was something in the word Cooper now that had nothing to do with mockery at all. Behind them, Gorak Ashclaw's roar of outrage split the square wide open. "This is not finished," he bellowed, shoving past his own father's restraining hand. "You do not simply walk away from me, Yash Steeljaw. You will not shame my clan before this whole crossing and expect no answer." Chief Draga Steeljaw, Yash's father, stepped forward then, his weathered face a battleground of fury and pride. "Your clan shamed itself the moment you burned a farm to ash, boy. Do not speak to me of shame." "Then let the old law answer it," Gorak snarled, and the square went cold at the words, because everyone present, human and orc alike who knew the old ways, understood exactly what he meant. "I claim challenge right. If Yash Steeljaw will not honor the marriage bond agreed between our fathers, then let her answer for it by combat, as any Steeljaw warrior would. If I win, she comes to my clan as promised, whatever her heart wants. If she wins, the Ashclaw will honor whatever choice she makes, and this truce stands renewed between us, sealed in blood rather than vows." Chief Draga's jaw tightened. He looked to his daughter, torn between a father's fear and a chief's understanding of what such a challenge meant for the fragile peace of the whole region. Yash, still cradling Tomas Bell's bleeding body in her arms, did not hesitate. "I accept," she said, "but not today. Today I have a man to save and men to make ready to be married. 10 days, Gorak. 10 days to nurse my rage into something steadier than yours, and then I will beat some sense into you in front of everyone who watched you burn a family alive." She turned and carried the wounded scout toward Jedediah's workshop without waiting for Gorak's answer, and Jedediah hurried alongside her, heart pounding with a dozen different fears, all fighting for space in his chest: fear for Tomas Bell's life, fear of the duel now hanging over Yash's head, and beneath it all, disbelieving and fierce, the astonishing joy of having just been chosen, in front of the entire crossroads, by the most extraordinary woman he had ever known. They worked through the night in Jedediah's shop, Yash holding lantern steady and fetching what he needed while he cleaned and stitched the gash in Tomas Bell's side, packed the wound with honey and moss, and forced willow bark tea past the young man's cracked lips until his fever broke toward dawn and his breathing steadied into something less like a death rattle. "He'll live," Jedediah said finally, sitting back on his heels, exhaustion settling into his bones like a physical weight. "Thanks to you getting him here quick as you did." "Thanks to your hands," Yash said, watching him with an expression he was still not fully used to, open, unguarded, entirely without the careful walls she had kept between them for 3 long months. "You are a remarkable man, Jedediah Quinn." "I make barrels," he said, half a laugh in his exhausted voice. "And apparently I've agreed to marry a woman who could crush me flatter than any keg I've ever built." "I would never crush you," she said, crossing the small room to kneel in front of him, taking his blood-stained hands in hers with a gentleness that made his throat tighten. "I would sooner crush anyone who tried to take you from me. Yash." He turned his hands to hold hers properly, calloused palm against calloused palm, and looked up into her golden eyes. "This duel. Gorek's twice your size and trained to war since he could walk. I've stitched enough wounds from ashclaw blades to know what he's capable of. And I have trained beside my father's finest warriors since I was old enough to hold a blade myself," she said, steady as stone. "I do not fear Gorek Ashclaw. I fear only what happens to this crossing, to this fragile piece if I lose. 10 days, Cooper. Help me make ready and trust me to do the rest." He should have argued further. Every careful, protective instinct in him wanted to. But he had watched this woman hold back a collapsing wall of barrels with her bare arms, had watched her face down an entire crowd's scorn without flinching, and he understood, in that quiet, exhausted hour before dawn, that the truest way he could love her was not by trying to shield her from a fight she had every right to choose, but by standing beside her while she fought it. "Then let's make ready," he said. The 10 days that followed were unlike anything Thornwell Crossing had seen in a generation. News of the broken wedding, the confessed massacre, and the challenge duel spread up and down the trade roads faster than any rider could carry it. And by the 4th day, wagons of curious onlookers, worried merchants, and armed men from both peoples had begun crowding into the crossing, some hoping to see history made, others simply afraid the fragile truce that let them trade in peace was about to collapse into open war regardless of who won a single duel. Chief Malek Ashclaw arrived on the 6th day with a warband easily 3 times the size any peaceful negotiation required, and the human magistrate of Thornwell Crossing, a nervous, careful man named Alden Pike, spent every waking hour trying to keep the crossing's own militia from doing something foolish out of fear. Prejudice, banked low for years under the truce's uneasy peace, flared bright and ugly in those tense days. Jedediah heard men mutter that no good could come of a human meddling in orc business, heard others spit that Yash Steeljaw had brought this whole mess down on decent folks' heads by refusing a marriage that would have kept 2 clans from each other's throats. He heard, too, uglier things said about himself, about what kind of man would let his woman fight his battles for him, about the shame of a cooper standing where a warrior should. He bore it because Yash needed him steady, not brawling in taverns over insults. But on the 8th day, a knot of drovers cornered him outside the trading post, 3 of them, drink-cloud and looking for a target for their fear, and one shoved him hard enough to send him sprawling into the mud. "Should have let the orc marry her own kind," the man sneered, "instead of dragging the rest of us into her mess." Jedediah was climbing back to his feet, jaw set, when a shadow fell over the drover from behind, and a hand closed on the man's shoulder with enough force to make him yelp. "You have something to say to my husband-to-be," Yash Steeljaw said, low and dangerous. "You may say it to me instead." The drover went white and stammered an apology so fast the words tumbled over each other, and his friends were already backing away, and Yash released him with a shove that sent him stumbling but unharmed, because, for all her strength, all her fury, she had never once used it on someone who did not truly deserve it. She turned to Jedediah, hauled him upright by one arm as though he weighed nothing at all, and brushed mud from his shoulder with a tenderness that contrasted so sharply with the violence just threatened that it made his chest ache. "I do not need protecting, Cooper," she said, "but I am glad to know you would try." "Someone's got to watch your back while you're busy being terrifying," he said, and she laughed. A real laugh, bright and unguarded, and kissed him then, right there in the open street with half the trading post watching, slow and sure and entirely unafraid of who saw. It was the first time she had let herself kiss him since the day the barrels fell, and it tasted like a promise finally being kept. On the 9th day, Jedediah spent the whole afternoon in his workshop, hands steady despite the fear coiling tight in his gut, crafting something he had never made before, a vambrace forearm guard, built the way he built his finest barrels, tight-fitted oak and iron banding, curved to Yash's arm, reinforced along the striking edge where a sword's blow might land. It would not stop a killing strike outright, but it would turn one, buy her half a heartbeat she might not otherwise have. He worked until his fingers cramped and his eyes burned, and when he pressed it into her hands that evening, she stared at it for a long moment before looking up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "You made this. Same craft as any cask," he said, throat tight. "Just wanted this one to protect something more important than water." She kissed him again, softer this time, and did not pull away. The 10th day dawned clear and cold, and the whole of Thornwell Crossing gathered in the wide flat field east of town, where the duel would be held. Humans and orcs packed shoulder to shoulder along makeshift fence lines, Chief Yash Steeljaw and Chief Malak Ashclaw seated on opposite sides with their retinues bristling around them. Magistrate Alden Pike, standing nervously between the two chiefs as the human authority who would witness the old law upheld. Yash Steeljaw walked into the ring wearing her fitted travel leathers rather than any ceremonial dress, Jedediah's vambrace strapped snug to her left forearm, her dark hair braided tight and practical, a short curved blade at her hip and a round hide shield in her free hand. She looked, Jedediah thought, watching from the fence line with his heart in his throat, like exactly what she was, a warrior born of a proud and ancient line, utterly unafraid, utterly magnificent. Gorak Ashclaw entered from the opposite side in full war harness, a massive two-handed blade resting on one shoulder, his face twisted with the particular ugly confidence of a man who had never once imagined he might lose. "Last chance, Yash," he called across the ring. "Yield now, marry as promised, and I will forgive this whole embarrassment." "I would rather die in this ring than spend one night as your wife," Yash answered, loud enough for both crowds to hear, and something in her voice steady, utterly without fear drew a murmur of grudging respect even from some of the Ashclaw warband. Magistrate Pike raised a trembling hand, glanced at both chiefs for confirmation, and dropped it. "Begin," he called, and stepped hastily back from the ring. Gorak came at her hard and fast, trusting his size and his massive blade to end things quickly, and for one terrible moment Jedediah's heart stopped as the two-handed sword came whistling down toward Yash's shoulder. She caught the blow on her shield, the impact driving her back a full step, wood splintering under the force, but she held, pivoted, and answered with a strike of her own that Gorak barely turned aside in time. The fight that followed was nothing like the tavern brawls or skirmish stories Jedediah had heard all his life. It was fast, brutal, and beautiful in the terrible way true skill always is. Yash lighter on her feet than her opponent, using his size against him, circling, testing, drawing him into overextending his massive swings while she conserved her strength. Twice Gorak's blade came close enough that Jedediah's whole body went cold with terror, and twice Yash's borrowed vambrace turned a strike that would otherwise have opened her arm to the bone, the reinforced oak and iron banding holding true exactly as Jedediah had built it to. The crowd, which had begun the duel divided and murmuring, grew steadily quieter as the fight wore on, watching Yash Steeljaw's skill assert itself blow by careful blow, watching Gorak's confidence curdle into frustration, and then something like fear as his massive strength failed again and again to break through her guard. It was in the fight's 15th minute, both combatants breathing hard, sweat slick and bloodied from shallow cuts, that Gorak did the thing that would end any last sympathy for him in that field. Sensing the fight slipping from his grasp, he snapped his fingers toward the Ashclaw line, and two of his warband warriors began climbing the fence, blades drawn, clearly intending to end the duel by numbers rather than honor. The crowd erupted in outraged shouts. Chief Malak Ashclaw himself surged to his feet, roaring at his own men to stand down, but the two warriors had already dropped into the ring behind Yash. Jedediah did not think. He was over the fence and into the ring before his mind had fully caught up with his body, snatching a fallen length of fence rail as a makeshift weapon, placing himself between Yash and the approaching warriors with nothing but stubbornness and a plank of wood to his name. "Touch her and you'll answer to every person in this crossing who's ever needed stitching from my hands," he shouted, voice cracking but steady, "including half your own kin." It was, by any sane measure, a foolish and hopeless stand. But it bought precisely the half a heartbeat needed. Yash, seeing her Cooper standing unarmed between her and two armed warriors, let out a roar that seemed to shake the very fence posts, spun from Gorak's last desperate strike, and drove her shield into the larger man's chest with such force that he was thrown backward off his feet entirely, the massive two-handed sword clattering from his grip. She did not stop there. In the same fluid motion, she caught the wrist of the nearest interfering warrior, twisted the blade from his hand, and hurled the man bodily over the fence into his own retreating comrades with a strength that left the entire field of onlookers, Ashclaw Warband included, staring in absolute, stunned silence. Then she turned back to Gorak, who lay sprawled and winded on the churned earth, and pressed the point of her recovered blade to his throat. "Call off your men," she said, "or I finish this the old way, right here in front of both our fathers." Chief Malak Ashclaw, white-faced with fury at his own son's dishonor, bellowed the order himself. The interfering warriors backed away, dropping their blades. Yash held her position a long moment, chest heaving, blade steady at Gorak's throat, and the whole field of Thornwell crossing, every human, every orc, every soul who had come to watch this duel decide the fate of the crossing's fragile peace held its breath. "I could kill you," she said, low enough that only Gorak and Jedediah standing close behind her could hear. "You have earned it twice over, for the family you burned and the cheat you just attempted, but I will not build my future on more blood than this crossing has already spilled. I want your father to hear this instead. The Ashclaw clan will honor the challenge's terms in full. This truce stands renewed, sealed by combat as your own son demanded. And if a single Ashclaw raider crosses a human border again under your banner, I will finish what I started here today." She withdrew the blade and stepped back, and Gorak Ashclaw lay in the dirt, stripped of every shred of the pride and confidence he had walked into that ring with, while the crowd around them, human and orc alike, erupted not into the tense murmur of before, but into something entirely different, a roar of astonished, wholehearted acclaim, for the woman who had just defeated a chief's son in single combat and shown mercy anyway. Chief Malak Ashclaw, grim-faced but bound by his own son's invoked law, rose and addressed the field. "The challenge is answered. The Ashclaw clan honors the terms. Chief Draga Steeljaw's daughter has won the right to choose her own path, and this truce stands renewed by combat, as our own law demands." His eyes cut once sharply to his son still sprawled in the dirt. "Gorak will answer to me for what he has done to this clan's honor, separately, and at length." Chief Draga Steeljaw came forward then, pride and relief warring plainly across his weathered face, and pulled his daughter into an embrace that lifted her clean off her feet, the whole crowd cheering around them. Jedediah, still standing in the ring with a splintered fence rail in his hands and his heart hammering fit to burst, found himself suddenly wrapped in Yash Steeljaw's arms as she turned from her father to him, lifting him off the ground the same way, laughing and crying all at once. "You stood in front of two armed warriors with a piece of fence," she said, half laughing, half scolding, setting him back on his feet but not letting go. "You utter fool. You could have died." "You'd already saved my life once," he said, breathless, grinning despite the tears in his own eyes. "Seemed only fair I try returning the favor, even if I did it badly." "You did it exactly as it needed doing," she said, and kissed him then in front of both chiefs, both warbands, and the entire assembled crowd of Thornwell Crossing, without a shred of hesitation or shame, and the crowd's roar redoubled around them. Magistrate Alden Pike, looking rather faint with relief that the whole affair had ended in renewed peace rather than open war, hurried forward to formally declare the challenge closed and the truce restored. And within the hour the tense, fear-thick crowd had transformed into something closer to a festival, trade wagons breaking out ale and food. Orc and human warriors who an hour before had stood ready to kill each other now trading war stories and wary, grudging respect over shared cups. It was 3 weeks later, once the dust had settled and the crossing had returned to its ordinary bustling rhythm, though nothing about it felt quite ordinary anymore, not with Yash Steeljaw's victory still the talk of every tavern from here to the mountains, that the real wedding took place. They held it in the same square where the first, disastrous ceremony had fallen apart, because Yash had insisted on it, saying she would not let Gorak's cruelty be the last memory that altar held. The stone altar had been rebuilt, the banners replaced, and this time the crowd that gathered was not divided along old lines of fear and prejudice, but genuinely, unreservedly glad drovers who had once muttered about orcs meddling in human business, now cheering loudest of all, orc traders and human merchants standing shoulder to shoulder without the old careful distance between them. Yash wore her wedding leathers again, the same deep ochre and blood red she had worn the first time, though she had asked Jedediah to add one thing to them beforehand, a narrow band of the same white oak he used in his finest barrels, carved and polished and worked into a cuff at her wrist, so that some part of his craft would be bound to her on this day, the way his hands had been bound to her heart for months already. Jedediah stood at the altar in his best coat, hands steady now, no dying man to catch, no crisis to answer, just Yash Steeljaw walking toward him across a square full of people who had watched them earn this moment through fire and blood and stubborn, patient love. Elder Ushka performed the binding this time without interruption, looping the cord twice around their joined wrists, murmuring the old Steeljaw words of joining, while Magistrate Pike stood ready to add the human vows as well, blending both traditions the way the crossing itself had learned, slowly and painfully, to blend two peoples into something stronger than either alone. "Yash Steeljaw," Jedediah said, when it came his turn to speak, voice rough with feeling, "I've spent my whole life patching up other people's wounds and never thought much about my own. I didn't know I was lonely until you walked into my yard and told me my barrels were an insult. I don't know how a plain cooper ended up the luckiest man on this whole crossing, but I know I'll spend every day I've got proving I deserve it." "Jedediah Quinn," Yash said, and her voice, so steady in battle, trembled now with an emotion she no longer bothered hiding from anyone. "I have fought warriors twice your size and feared none of them. I feared only that I might have to spend my life without you, doing my duty to a peace built on lies, married to a man who would have made me smaller every single day. You have never once tried to make me smaller. You built me armor with your own hands and stood unarmed between me and death, because you loved me too much to stay behind a fence. I choose you, not out of duty, not to seal any treaty. I choose you because you are the truest, bravest, gentlest man I have ever known, and I intend to keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." The cord tightened around their joined wrists, and Elder Ushka pronounced them bound, and the whole square of Thornwell Crossing, human and orc, drover and warrior, everyone who had once doubted whether such a marriage could ever hold, erupted into cheering loud enough to reach the mountains. That night, once the celebration had wound down into contented murmurs, and the last lanterns had guttered low along the square, Yash Steeljaw led her new husband away from the noise, back to the small cooper's house behind the workshop that had been his whole quiet world for so many lonely years and would now, at last, be theirs together. There was no more duty standing between them, no more careful walls, no more denial stretched thin across months of longing glances and stolen, incomplete moments. She undid her wedding leathers slowly, watching his face the whole while with a warmth that made his chest ache in the very best way, and when he reached for her at last, hands that had built 100 barrels and stitched 100 wounds now trembling for an entirely different reason, she caught them gently and pressed them against her heart. "No more waiting," she murmured against his mouth. "No more 10-day duels or broken truces standing between us. Just this. Just us. Just us, he agreed, and the rest of the night passed in a warmth neither of them had words enough left to speak of afterward, only the quiet, certain knowledge that whatever the crossroads brought them in the years ahead, they would face it exactly as they had won this moment together, equal and entirely unafraid. In the months that followed, the truce Yash's victory had won held firm, stronger than it had ever been before, for word of the honest duel and the mercy shown afterward traveled far up and down the trade roads, and other clans and other border towns began looking to Thornwell Crossing as proof that peace between orc and human was not merely possible, but could be forged into something lasting. Yash took up a place at her father's side as an emissary of that peace, respected now by human and orc alike not merely as a chief's daughter, but as a warrior who had proven her honor before the whole crossing. Jedediah's cooper shop thrived busier than ever. His barrels carried the length of the trade roads with a new mark burned proudly beside the old quail, a small wolf's head, in honor of the woman who had once called his craft an insult and ended up trusting her life to it. And in the evenings, when the workshop grew quiet and the lanterns burned low, they would sit together at the same table where Yash had once told him duty mattered more than what she wanted, sharing a bowl of stew the way they had in those long, aching months of denial, except now her hand rested easily over his without hesitation, without fear, without anything at all standing between the cooper and the orc bride who had turned from an altar full of betrayal and chosen, in front of the whole watching world. Exactly the life she wanted,